The gentle evening breeze carried the soft sounds of clinking glasses and quiet conversations through the grand entrance of Le Baroque, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. The warm glow from crystal chandeliers bathed the dining room in golden light, making the polished silverware sparkle like tiny stars on perfectly pressed white tablecloths. At the heart of this elegant space stood a magnificent antique grand piano, its deep mahogany surface reflecting the shimmer of candlelight. This wasn't just any piano, it was a restored 1920s Steinway that had once graced Carnegie Hall. Now it sat proudly in the restaurant center, waiting for special occasions when professional musicians would bring it to life. Among the busy staff weaving between tables was a young waitress named Lynn, her neat uniform and graceful movements matching the restaurant's refined atmosphere. What none of the wealthy patrons knew was that behind her quiet efficiency lay years of dedication to music. Every time she passed the piano during her shifts, her fingers would twitch ever so slightly, remembering the feel of ivory keys beneath them. Tonight was different from regular evenings at Le Baroque. The restaurant was hosting an exclusive private party for New York's elite, business tycoons, tech entrepreneurs, and real estate moguls who could spend more on a single meal than Lynn earned in a month. The air buzzed with important conversations about million-dollar deals and upcoming charity galas. The kitchen was in overdrive, preparing elaborate dishes that looked more like art pieces than food. Lynn moved skillfully between tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes and carefully plated appetizers. Her shoes, though chosen for comfort, were starting to pinch after hours of walking on the hardwood floors, but she maintained her warm smile and attentive service. As she worked, Lynn couldn't help but notice how the piano stood silent tonight. Usually, on special occasions like this, the restaurant would hire a pianist, but their regular performer had called in sick at the last minute. The absence of music left a noticeable gap in the atmosphere, like a painting missing its final brush stroke. The evening was progressing smoothly until a particular group arrived fashionably late, commanding attention as they entered. Leading them was a man whose reputation preceded him, a tech millionaire known for his extravagant lifestyle and demanding nature. His custom-made suit and gold watch caught the light as he gestured dramatically, telling some apparently hilarious story to his companions. Lynn was assigned to their section, and from the moment she approached their table, she could feel the weight of their scrutiny. The tech millionaire barely glanced at her as she began her usual warm greeting, instead continuing his loud conversation about his latest yacht purchase. His companions, clearly used to his behavior, offered apologetic smiles as they ordered drinks. The piano sat between Lynn's section and the kitchen, making it impossible for her to avoid passing it constantly. Each time she did, she felt a familiar longing, remembering the hours she'd spent practicing in music rooms and concert halls. But those dreams had been put on hold when life took an unexpected turn, leading her to this job at Le Baroque. Little did she know that this ordinary evening was about to become extraordinary, and that silent piano would soon play a crucial role in changing her life forever. The tech millionaire was getting increasingly intoxicated on expensive wine, his voice growing louder, his demands more particular, and his patience shorter with each passing minute. The other guests in the restaurant occasionally glanced toward their table, some with curiosity, others with disapproval. Lynn remained professional, handling each demanding request with grace. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that a storm was brewing, one that would either break her spirit or lead to an unexpected triumph that no one in the room could have predicted. The evening at Le Baroque was reaching its peak when things started to take an uncomfortable turn. The tech millionaire, Mr. Zhang, had consumed his fourth glass of premium wine, his voice growing increasingly loud with each sip. His expensive watch caught the light as he gestured dramatically, nearly knocking over a crystal glass that Lynn quickly steadied with practiced ease. "You know," he announced to his table, loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "I find it fascinating how some people settle for certain career choices." His eyes fixed on Lynn as she carefully placed fresh bread on their table. The other guests at his table shifted uncomfortably, some staring intently at their plates, others offering apologetic glances in Lynn's direction. Lynn maintained her professional composure, though her cheeks flushed slightly. She dealt with difficult customers before, but something about Mr. Zhang's attitude struck a particularly painful chord. As she turned to leave, he called out, "Oh, waitress," snapping his fingers as if summoning a pet. "Yes, at her," Lin responded politely, turning back to face him. "I couldn't help but notice," he said, swirling his wine glass, "how you keep looking at that piano. What's the matter? Wishing you could play?" His tone dripped with condescension, and a few of his companions chuckled nervously. Lin's eyes involuntarily darted to the magnificent instrument. She hadn't realized her glances had been so obvious. The piano seemed to gleam under the chandelier light, almost as if it were responding to the tension in the room. "I saw that," Mr. Zhang exclaimed, sitting up straighter. "You do want to play, don't you?" His voice had taken on a theatrical quality that drew attention from nearby tables. The regular dinner chatter began to die down as more people turned to watch the scene unfolding. "Sir, would you like me to bring you anything else?" Lin attempted to redirect the conversation professionally, but Mr. Zhang wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, making a show of extracting several $100 bills. "Let's make this interesting, shall we?" he announced, waving the money in the air. "I'll give you $1,000 right now if you can play anything decent on that piano." The restaurant had grown eerily quiet. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed muted, as if the whole establishment was holding its breath. A few other wealthy patrons looked on with interest, while others appeared embarrassed by the display. "I'm here to serve your table, sir," Lin replied quietly, her hands clasped in front of her apron to hide their slight trembling. "Oh, come on," Mr. Zhang pressed, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Isn't this what you people dream of? A chance to show off? To pretend you belong in a place like this?" He laughed, and this time none of his companions joined in. The restaurant's manager, Mr. Chen, had noticed the commotion and was making his way over, but before he could intervene, Mr. Zhang stood up slightly unsteady from the wine. "Look, everyone," he announced to the room at large. "Our waitress here thinks she's a pianist. Shall we give her a chance to embarrass herself?" Several guests gasped quietly. An elderly woman at a nearby table covered her mouth in shock. Lin stood perfectly still, her face a mask of composure, though her heart raced beneath her uniform. "Well?" Mr. Zhang pressed, now holding up the money like a trophy. "What's it going to be? Show us what you can do, or admit you're just dreaming above your station." He gestured grandly toward the piano, nearly losing his balance in the process. The room waited in tense silence. Lin felt every eye on her, some pitying, others curious, a few even eager to see what would happen next. The piano keys seemed to beckon to her from across the room, bringing back memories she'd tried so hard to push aside. Mr. Chen had finally reached their table, ready to intervene, but Lin caught his eye. Something in her expression made him pause. The air in the restaurant crackled with tension as Lin slowly untied her apron, her movements deliberate and dignified. Nobody in that dining room could have guessed what was about to happen next, least of all Mr. Zhang, who stood swaying slightly, a triumphant smirk playing across his face. The next few moments would not only shatter his preconceptions, but would change the course of several lives forever. What the smirking Mr. Zhang and the breathless onlookers didn't know was that the quiet waitress they'd been watching had a story of her own, one that would have made them think twice about their assumptions. Just 6 months earlier, Lin had been preparing for her final recital at one of the world's most prestigious music schools. Her journey there hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small apartment above her parents' grocery store, she had learned to play on a second-hand upright piano, practicing late into the night after helping at the store. Her parents had sacrificed everything to nurture her talent, working extra hours to pay for lessons from a retired concert pianist who lived in their neighborhood. Their sacrifice had paid off when Lin earned a full scholarship to study piano performance. For 3 years, she had thrived, spending countless hours in practice rooms, her fingers dancing across the keys as she mastered pieces that had challenged pianists for centuries. Her professors had called her a rare talent, someone who didn't just play the notes but brought them to life with deep emotion. Then life had thrown an unexpected curve. Her father had suffered a minor heart attack, forcing him to step back from the family business. The medical bills had piled up, and even with insurance, they struggled to keep the store running. Lin's mother was working double shifts, her hands growing rough from restocking shelves and working the register. When the university announced budget cuts that slashed her scholarship in half, Lin had faced an impossible choice. She could either take out massive loans to continue her studies or put her dreams on hold to help her family. The decision had torn at her heart, but in the end, family came first. She had withdrawn from school temporarily, promising herself it wouldn't be forever. That's how she had ended up at Le Baroque, working as a waitress to send money home while saving what she could for tuition. Every day, she'd walk past the gorgeous grand piano, its presence both a comfort and a reminder of her postponed dreams. During quiet moments, she would imagine herself playing it, her fingers unconsciously moving through the pieces she had memorized. The restaurant's regular pianist, an elderly gentleman who played 3 nights a week, had noticed her looking at the piano. One afternoon before the dinner rush, he had asked her if she played. When she admitted her background, his eyes had lit up with understanding. He'd offered to let her practice on the piano during off hours, but she had politely declined, not wanting to draw attention to herself or risk her job. Some nights, after her shift ended, Lynn would sit on the subway platform, waiting for the train home, and silently practice finger exercises on her knees. The music never left her. It lived in her heart, in her mind, in the way she moved through the world with a dancer's grace despite carrying heavy trays and dealing with demanding customers. None of her co-workers knew about her musical background. To them, she was just Lynn, reliable, hardworking, always willing to cover an extra shift or help out during the rush. She had overheard some of them wondering why someone so educated would work as a waitress, but she never corrected their assumptions. There was dignity in all work. Her father had taught her that, and she carried that belief with pride. But now, standing in the hushed dining room with Mr. Zhang's challenge hanging in the air, Lynn felt the weight of her hidden talent like a fire in her chest. The magnificent piano before her was far superior to anything she had ever played. Its keys had known the touch of genuine masters, and its strings had sung some of the most beautiful compositions ever written. As she looked at the instrument, memories flooded back. The standing ovation at her first recital, the tears in her mother's eyes when she received her scholarship letter, the joy of mastering a particularly challenging piece. These memories mixed with more recent ones, the worried conversations about bills, her father's pale face in the hospital bed, the letter announcing her scholarship reduction. The other waitstaff watched her with confusion, wondering why she hadn't simply walked away from Mr. Zhang's rudeness. The manager, Mr. Chen, still stood nearby, ready to step in if needed. But Lynn's mind was already made up. Sometimes life presents moments that seem custom-made for revealing hidden truths, and this was one of them. What was about to happen would do more than just put a rude customer in his place. It would remind everyone present that appearances can be deceiving and that extraordinary talent can exist in the most unexpected places. As Lynn took her first step toward the piano, she felt a curious mix of nervousness and calm, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. Time seemed to slow down in the elegant dining room of Le Baroque. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the faces of expectant diners, all eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Lynn stood perfectly still, her serving tray pressed against her crisp uniform as Mr. Zhang's challenge echoed in her mind. The $1,000 he mockingly offered would cover next month's payment for her father's medical bills. That thought alone made her fingers twitch, but this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about something deeper, about dignity, truth, and the moment when you decide to stand up for yourself. A young couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes filled with sympathy. An older gentleman in an expensive suit shook his head disapprovingly at Mr. Zhang's behavior. The other waitstaff had stopped their duties, watching with a mix of concern and curiosity. Even the kitchen staff had poked their heads out through the swinging doors, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Lynn felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was Mrs. Wu, a regular customer in her 70s who always ordered the same dish and left generous tips. "Dear," she whispered, "you don't have to do this. That man is being horrible." The kindness in her voice almost brought tears to Lynn's eyes. Mr. Chen, the manager, stepped closer. In the 3 months Lynn had worked at Le Baroque, he had come to respect her work ethic and quiet dignity. Now, seeing the look of determination in her eyes, he understood that this moment was about more than just handling a difficult customer. "Lynn," he said softly, so only she could hear, "whatever you decide, we support you." His words carried the weight of trust, giving her permission to follow her heart. Taking a deep breath, Lynn carefully placed her serving tray on an empty table. The silverware clinked softly against the fine china, the sound sharp in the hushed room. With deliberate movements, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the tray. Mr. Zhang watched with amusement, clearly expecting her to walk away embarrassed. Instead, Lynn squared her shoulders and turned toward the piano. As she took her first step, a memory flashed through her mind, her father's voice from years ago, telling her that true strength isn't about proving others wrong, but about being true to yourself. The walk to the piano felt like both a moment and an eternity. Her comfortable work shoes made soft sounds against the hardwood floor, each step bringing her closer to a moment of truth. The magnificent instrument waited for her, its polished surface reflecting the warm lighting of the restaurant. Some of Mr. Zhang's friends had started to look uncomfortable, perhaps realizing that their entertainment might not unfold as they expected. One of them tried to pull at his sleeve, suggesting they should leave, but he waved them off, his wine glass still clutched in his hand. As Lynn approached the piano bench, memories of countless performances flooded her mind. She remembered her first recital at age 8, playing on a worn-out upright piano in her community center. She thought of the late nights practicing in university practice rooms, her dreams of performing in concert halls seeming both impossible and within reach. The piano bench was cool beneath her fingers as she adjusted it, muscle memory from years of training taking over. A complete silence had fallen over the restaurant, even the usual kitchen noise had ceased. It was the kind of silence that comes before something momentous, heavy with anticipation and possibility. Lynn sat down, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, just as her first teacher had taught her. She took a moment to center herself, her hands hovering over the keys. In this brief pause, she wasn't thinking about Mr. Zhang's smirk or the watching crowd. Instead, she thought of her parents' sacrifices, of their unwavering belief in her talent, of all the twists and turns that had led her to this precise moment. The first notes she would play would do more than just break the silence. They would shatter preconceptions and remind everyone present that magic can happen in the most unexpected places. As her fingers prepared to strike the keys, Lynn felt a curious sense of peace. Whatever happened next would change everything, and she was ready. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant, soft as raindrops, yet clear as crystal. Lynn's fingers touched the keys with gentle precision, coaxing out the piece's famous opening chords. The sound wrapped around the dining room like a warm embrace, causing several guests to close their eyes instinctively. Mr. Zhang's smirk froze on his face. He hadn't expected this. These weren't the simple tunes of an amateur. These were the confident notes of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. His wine glass remained suspended halfway to his mouth, forgotten. As the introduction built in intensity, Lynn's hands began to move with increasing confidence across the keys. The magnificent Steinway responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for her all along. The melancholic theme emerged, filling the space with emotion that seemed to touch every heart in the room. A young boy at a family's table stopped eating his dessert, his spoon hovering in midair as he watched Lynn's hands dance across the keyboard. His mother wiped a tear from her eye, remembering perhaps her own abandoned dreams. The kitchen staff had completely abandoned their duties, standing in the doorway, mesmerized by the music flowing through their usually chaotic workspace. The piece progressed, and Lynn lost herself in the music. Her shoulders swayed slightly as her fingers flew through the challenging runs and arpeggios. This wasn't just technical skill, this was pure emotion translated into sound. The restaurant's excellent acoustics carried every note perfectly, from the thunderous fortissimos to the most delicate pianissimos. Mr. Chen, the manager, stood transfixed. In all his years running Le Baroque, he had never heard their piano sing like this. Professional pianists had played it regularly, but there was something different about Lynn's performance, a hunger, a passion, a story being told through music. As she reached the famous second movement, several diners had tears in their eyes. The melody soared through the room, speaking of loss, hope, and triumph. A couple who had been arguing earlier now held hands across their table, their disagreement forgotten in the face of such beauty. The waitstaff watched their colleague with newfound respect and awe. They saw how her whole being transformed at the piano. She was no longer the quiet server who helped them during busy shifts, but an artist in her element, sharing her gift with the world. Mr. Zhang's friends had stopped trying to pretend this wasn't extraordinary. One of them actually glared at him, embarrassed by their earlier laughter. The $1,000 he had mockingly offered now seemed insulting in the face of such talent. The technical challenges of the piece, the crossed hands, the complex rhythms, the rapid key changes, Lin handled them all with graceful ease. Her years of training showed in every phrase, every nuance, every perfectly timed pause. This was what she had been born to do, what she had sacrificed so much to pursue. An elderly gentleman in the corner, who had been quietly dining alone, leaned forward in his seat. His trained eye recognized more than just talent. He saw the years of dedication, the hours of practice, the pure love of music that radiated from every note. His hand unconsciously conducted along with the familiar piece, his eyes never leaving Lin's transformed figure at the piano. As she approached the finale, the music built to a crescendo that seemed to make the chandeliers tremble. The passionate themes wove together in a display of musical fireworks that left the audience breathless. Lin's fingers flew across the keys with both power and precision, building to the piece's triumphant conclusion. The last chords rang out through the restaurant, hanging in the air like a spell. For a moment, complete silence followed, that magical pause after a great performance when the audience is still caught in the music's embrace. Lin's hands rested gently on the keys, her heart pounding, her breath coming in small gasps from the emotional and physical effort of the performance. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. It started with a single person, the elderly gentleman in the corner, and spread like wildfire through the restaurant. People stood from their tables, their faces shining with genuine emotion. The kitchen staff cheered and whistled. Even the normally reserved Mr. Chen was clapping with unrestrained enthusiasm. As the standing ovation continued, Lin remained seated at the piano, overwhelmed by the moment. She had done more than just prove Mr. Zhang wrong. She had reminded herself of who she truly was, of the power of music to transform not just the performer, but everyone who listens. In this moment, she wasn't just a waitress who could play the piano. She was an artist who had found her way back to her true calling. As the applause finally began to fade, the elderly gentleman who had watched so intently rose from his corner table. His movements were deliberate as he made his way through the still standing crowd toward the piano. People stepped aside respectfully, somehow sensing his importance. What nobody in the restaurant knew was that this unassuming diner was Dr. Wang, the dean of the city's most prestigious music conservatory. Lin stood from the piano bench, smoothing her waitress uniform with slightly trembling hands. The adrenaline of the performance still coursed through her veins, making the room seem somehow brighter, more vivid. Around her, conversations had erupted as guests discussed what they'd just witnessed, their voices filled with excitement and wonder. Mr. Zhang had sunk back into his chair, his face a mixture of embarrassment and amazement. The $1,000 he'd waved around earlier lay forgotten on his table, his expensive wine untouched. His friends were pointedly avoiding his eyes, some of them already gathering their things to leave. "Young lady," Dr. Wang said as he approached, his voice carrying the weight of decades of musical expertise, "that was extraordinary." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, its gold lettering catching the light. "I don't suppose you've heard of the winter concert series at the conservatory." Lin's eyes widened slightly. Every music student knew about the prestigious winter concert series. It was a launching pad for careers, a showcase of the finest musical talents in the city. "Yes, sir," she replied softly, "I have." "Well," he continued, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes, "our featured pianist for this season has unfortunately fallen ill. We've been searching for a replacement, someone with both technical skill and emotional depth." He paused, looking at her intently. "I believe we've just found her." The restaurant had grown quiet again as people realized another significant moment was unfolding. Mr. Chen stood nearby, beaming with pride at his employee's hidden talent. The other waitstaff watched with a mixture of joy and disbelief as their colleague's life changed before their eyes. "But there's more," Dr. Wang continued. "Your performance of Rachmaninoff showed not just talent, but years of training. May I ask where you studied?" Lin's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "I was at the National Conservatory until 6 months ago, sir." "Family circumstances." She trailed off, not wanting to elaborate on her personal struggles in front of the crowd. Dr. Wang's eyebrows rose in recognition. "Ah, you must be the student Professor Liu mentioned, the one who left despite having such promise." He shook his head sadly. He was quite upset about losing you to circumstances. A well-dressed woman at a nearby table stepped forward. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, no relation to the manager, a member of the conservatory's board of trustees. "We've recently established a hardship fund for talented students facing financial difficulties," she said, her voice warm with purpose. "It would be our honor to offer you a full scholarship to complete your studies." Lin's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. The kitchen staff broke into spontaneous applause, and soon the whole restaurant joined in again. Even some of Mr. Zhang's friends were clapping, though he himself seemed to have shrunk in his seat. Mr. Chen stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lin's shoulder. "Lin," he said with fatherly pride, "I think we need to discuss a change in your position here." She looked at him questioningly. "We've been looking for a weekend pianist for our evening service. The pay is triple your current salary, and the hours would work around your studies." The events unfolding seemed almost dreamlike. Lin thought of her parents, of their sacrifices, of her father's hospital bills. With the scholarship and the new position, she could help her family while pursuing her dreams. It seemed impossible that just an hour ago, she had been quietly serving tables, her talent hidden from the world. Dr. Wang was already talking about repertoire for the winter concert series, his excitement evident in his animated gestures. Mrs. Chen had pulled out her phone, eager to start the scholarship paperwork right away. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with energy, everyone feeling privileged to have witnessed this moment of destiny. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve at a nearby table, her eyes shining with inspiration. "Mama," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "I want to practice my piano more when we get home." Her words brought smiles to several faces, a reminder that one person's courage can spark motivation in others. The evening had transformed from a potential moment of humiliation into something magical, a reminder that talent and determination can emerge triumphant in the most unexpected circumstances. As Lin stood there, surrounded by her new supporters and well-wishers, she felt the weight of months of worry lifting from her shoulders. Sometimes, she realized, life's greatest opportunities come disguised as challenges, waiting for us to be brave enough to face them. The events of that remarkable evening at Le Baroque set in motion a series of changes that touched many lives. In the days that followed, the story spread through the city's music community like wildfire. The tale of a waitress who had stunned a restaurant full of elite diners with her extraordinary piano playing. 1 week after the performance, Lin sat in the conservatory's registration office, still hardly believing her good fortune. Mrs. Chen, true to her word, had expedited the scholarship paperwork. The hardship fund would cover not just her tuition, but also provide a stipend for living expenses. For the first time in months, Lin could focus on her music without worrying about her family's financial struggles. Her first weekend as Le Baroque's house pianist drew a full house. Regular customers who had known her as their waitress now requested specific pieces, beaming with pride as if they had personally discovered her talent. Mr. Chen had even printed special dinner menus that featured her name and biography, turning what had been a standard dinner service into an anticipated musical event. But perhaps the most surprising change came from Mr. Zhang himself. The morning after her performance, a large envelope had arrived at the restaurant addressed to Lin. Inside was a handwritten letter of apology, along with a generous check made out to her father's medical fund. The letter spoke of humility, of learning hard lessons about judgment and prejudice. Mr. Zhang wrote about his own immigrant parents who had worked in restaurants and how he had forgotten his roots in his rise to success. The next month, Mr. Zhang returned to Le Baroque, this time with a different attitude. He requested a quiet table near the piano and listened intently as Lin played. After her performance, he approached her with respect, not to apologize again, but to share something personal. His daughter, he explained, had been refusing to continue her piano lessons, seeing them as a burden. After hearing about Lin's story, she had changed her mind, inspired by the possibility of what dedication to music could achieve. The impact rippled further. Mr. Zhang, transformed by the experience, approached the conservatory with a proposal. He would establish a scholarship fund specifically for working students in the arts, ensuring that talent would never again have to be put on hold due to financial constraints. The fund was named, at his insistence, the El Baroque Scholarship for Emerging Artists. Lynn's parents attended her first performance in the Winter Concert Series. Her father, now recovered enough to travel, sat in the front row with tears in his eyes as his daughter received a standing ovation. The grocery store they had struggled to keep open was now thriving, managed by her mother with help from newly hired staff. Their daughter's success had brought unexpected attention to their small family business. The young girl who had promised to practice more after witnessing Lynn's restaurant performance had kept her word. 6 months later, she gave her first recital, and Lynn made sure to attend. Watching the child bow nervously before playing, Lynn remembered her own early performances and felt the beautiful continuity of music passing from one generation to the next. Le Baroque itself was transformed. What had been a prestigious but somewhat stuffy establishment became known as a place where excellence could emerge from unexpected corners. Mr. Chen made it a point to learn about his employees' dreams and talents, creating opportunities for them to grow beyond their current roles. The restaurant's motto, elegantly scripted beneath its name, now read, "Where every night holds the possibility of magic." 1 year after that fateful night, Lynn sat at the same grand piano where it had all begun. The restaurant was closing for the evening, the last customers lingering over coffee and dessert. As her fingers moved across the keys, playing a gentle nocturne, she thought about how life could change in an instant, how a moment of courage could open doors you never knew existed. At a corner table, a new waitress was serving coffee to an elderly couple. Lynn noticed how the young woman's eyes kept drifting to the piano, her fingers tapping silently against her serving tray in time with the music. Lynn smiled, remembering herself in that same position a year ago. After finishing her piece, she would invite the waitress to play. After all, everyone deserves a chance to let their light shine. The story of the waitress and the piano became a kind of modern fairy tale in the city's cultural circles, but unlike fairy tales, its magic didn't lie in supernatural transformations or fairy godmothers. Its magic was in the very human elements, courage in the face of mockery, talent surviving despite hardship, and the power of music to bridge divides and remind us all of our shared humanity. As Lynn's final notes faded into the warm evening air, they carried with them a simple but powerful truth. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with someone simply being brave enough to be who they truly are.